Mr. Fitzsimmons, Mr. Hoblick, Ms. Jameson, Mr. Geronimo, Mr. Lights, Mr. Malmberg,
Here.
Ms. Morrissey, I don't see her yet, Mr. Surratt,
Here.
and Ms. Whittick. So we do have a quorum.
I forgot. I knew I was doing something wrong. Thank you. Has everyone had the opportunity to read the November 6th minutes that I just somehow got rid of, evaporated from my computer? Yes, no? Okay. Does anyone? I'm looking for it again because I decided to go paperless today. Obviously, that didn't work well. Does anyone have someone like to make a motion to approve, or does anyone have modifications to those minutes?
I found
All right.
December 4th.
Too late this time, Sarah Lee, but you've got to crack it December. So motion made by John Hoblick, seconded by Bill Lights. Any discussion? All those in favor of approving the November minutes? Say aye. Any
Aye.
opposed? Oh, who's there?
We need, if she's, yeah, if Bliss is going to be
Bliss.
online, we need to allow her.
Okay. So let's take a pause in the vote on the minutes, I guess. And would anyone like to move that Bliss be allowed to participate remotely? Any second? Okay, the motion made by Donna Brosmer, seconded by Tyler Melmberg to allow Bliss Jameson to participate remotely. Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye. Any opposed? Okay, we will return then to the motion that was on the floor about the November 6 minutes that I still can't find. And there was no discussion. We were at the vote. All those in favor? All those, any opposed? Okay, the November minutes are approved. Let's move on to the December minutes.
Ms. Chair, I did find 2 typos on page 4 that I would like to fix when we finalize these minutes.
Would you like to call those out?
It's on page 4, line 32. There's the word close and it should be closed. And then there's the word even and it should be event.
Okay, and I had a few things on the I did. I felt that the sentence lines 20 through 23 was a little bit.
Which page, ma'am?
Page. Page 2.
Okay.
Excuse me. I have a suggested rewrite that it reads, Chair Lammers noted the increased rainfall patterns and flooding being attributed to new development. Though flooding is most likely multifactorial. She added that she would like more voices on the data to help determine if it is strict enough, it being the boring requirements. If the increasing rainfall pattern continues. And it just sounded like that what was being attributed was awkward. So I would just suggest a change that I can email over. Chair Lammers noted that flooding is being attributed to new development without recognizing increased rainfall patterns and that flooding is likely multifactorial. She said she would like more sources or input on the data to help determine if, given a continued increased rainfall pattern, it is strict enough. That at least was what I intended to say.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's legal to make a change. And on page 4, line 34, toward the end, the right margin, in the even of, it should be event. Maybe that's the one that Ginger said. And that's all I had. Anybody else have anything? Okay. So would someone like to move that amended minutes be approved?
So
So we have the motion made by John Geronimo, seconded by Tyler Malmberg. Any discussion? All those in favor, ayes?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. The minutes are approved as amended. Something has happened here. Next, we have old business, an update from Ginger about LID and stormwater management.
Clay's gonna take it. He just got out of agenda conference, and so some of the scheduling just got changed. I did want to point out two things that are coming up though. On Thursday is our first council meeting of the year. Council will be doing their goal setting at that meeting. That might be of interest. And then next Tuesday, the 14th, the council's having their special meeting regarding the moratorium. So just wanted to throw that out there, and then Clay can give us the update on our specific ordinances and dates.
Good afternoon. In regards to the stormwater and LID ordinances, as you all are aware, the LID ordinance has been blessed by this group, sent forward to the Planning and Land Development Regulation Commission. They have made their motion and recommendation. That's ready and actually advertised for the January 21st meeting. Given that the stormwater standards that y'all have also approved are going to be going to the Planning and Land Development Regulation Commission next Thursday, January 16th, the manager would like to take both of those proposed ordinances at the same time to the council rather than trying to split that conversation up over two separate meetings. So right now we're looking to see if it could possibly go to the first meeting in February. We would also tie that in. What's that?
Second meeting in February?
Well, we're seeing if we can get it on for the first, but there's right now no promise as to what it is. It will be going, both of those items will be going in February, but if we can get it in there, we will. Correct. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay.
So one more time, as I convolutedly confused everybody and created havoc amongst the board.
It's easy to do right now.
Yes. What was originally advertised for a January 21st for the LID, that will be taken off the agenda and will be partnered with the stormwater standards. We hope to get it in there as quickly as possible. The latest would be the second meeting in February. Okay.
Great.
So LID will not be on the January 21st county council meeting. We are also aware that this group it's time and appropriate for y'all to provide the annual report and your 2025 goal.
Excuse me, I can't hear anything.
This is Don with the city of Atlanta. I can't hear anything either, but I heard you.
Okay, well, I just heard, okay, well, I hear you.
But yeah, I thought I had a problem on my end. So I'm glad to see somebody else couldn't hear.
All right, it should be good.
Can you hear us now?
Yes, thank you.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, thank
And Donald, I think we heard you. You are with the city of DeLand?
you. Yes,
Okay, thank you, sir.
thank you.
Welcome. So I don't know at what point you lost the ability to hear us, but we went over the draft annual plan, made 2 date corrections in it, and voted to approve it. And we were moving on now to our work plan. Ginger, did you have something? No, okay. We're moving on to the work plan, which is on the screen now. And I might note just one. Tyler requested quite strongly, and we agreed that this meeting, given time, we would talk about our number 3 priority there, because there was something time sensitive about that you will share with us today, I hope. But other than that, how do we
So just so everyone knows, the way these priorities are ranked here is we received your priority rankings and Samantha did a snazzy spreadsheet to take the average, and this was basically how everything averaged out. The issue of the number 3, we will talk about that some today. That's on the end of our agenda today. I think that discussion may determine whether this item is done and off of here, or if it actually becomes a priority. So, I mean, there may be some value in having that discussion first and then deciding if there's more to talk about and it needs to be on the list. I don't know how you want to proceed on that.
am I allowed to opine on that?
Yes,
I think
ma'am.
that would be a good idea. Because everything else is stuff that we have been discussing or planned to discuss before. So shall we move on in the agenda to the reclaimed water irrigation / landscaping?
Yeah, and I mean, if you'd like, I can explain what my reasoning for this discussion is.
And I would just, or maybe Ginger, which is to preface before you kick it off, Tyler, we were all sent links to comp plan, to LDC on this item, and to Chapter 50 minimum standards to review. So I hope we got a chance to do that. And it's my understanding we have staff in the room to respond to questions, and we have DeLand on the.
Yeah, and again, just real quick before we get started, we had invited our water resources and utilities folks to this meeting. Unfortunately, there's some illness, so we don't have anyone from water resources and utilities. So if there are questions that are related to that, we'll probably have to just note them down and come back with answers. But
We
Mr.
got
Case,
Tad.
Mr. Casebeer is here from engineering. So
Too big to hide, but I hadn't seen you.
And Ben Bartlett, our Public Works Director, unfortunately had a conflict in scheduling. He actually has 3 different meetings he's trying to be at the same time. It's not practical. Yeah, no, we have no clones.
So in my conversations with community members and listening to speakers at council meetings, city of DeLand, Volusia County mostly, I've heard a lot of conversations that there are flooding problems. I'm hearing an echo, sorry. Yeah. That we have flooding problems that are in basins where we are pumping substantial amounts of reclaimed water into ponds for storage. And one of the things that I have limited knowledge on the practice of, I'm not an operator of this, and I don't deal with utility permitting at this scale for municipalities. Something that I'm hoping that I'm glad to see that Don is on the line. I'm hoping Michelle can also help inform us. I think we need to have conversation about it. We need to actually research a little bit ourselves into the topic of, is pumping water within our basins contributing to our flooding problem? And I don't have enough information to have an informed position. I'm pretty ignorant on this, to be perfectly blunt, in terms of scale.
And that was also a question or a statement by Chair Mills of the PLDRC about that. Clay.
Just one quick bit of clarification before coming in here. I was able to talk with both Tad and Ben Bartlett, and so Tad can correct whatever I'm about to say if I misspeak. Right now, in Volusia County, you have multiple utilities, and some have reclaim that can be utilized for irrigation. Some do not. Most of them are trending towards that because they see that as an alternative water supply, which gets some good points with St. Johns River Water Management District, and it's just a good practice. We in Volusia County, within our utilities, do not require storage of reclaim in stormwater ponds. We don't want to do that. What we have are tanks and rapid infiltration basins. So from a county perspective, in regards to our regulations, first and foremost, Chapter 72, in regards to subdivisions, we don't require connection to reclaim in our subdivision standards because some of our projects are not in our own utilities. A lot of our utilities serve like DeBerry, Oak Hill, those types of areas. So where our reclaim standards are in Chapter 122 of the code, which is our utilities. And that's where it's a proximity requirement and capacity requirement. So if you were within the appropriate distance of our reclaim lines and we have the capacity and you're coming in with a project that would benefit from using reclaim, we require you to connect. So right now, the concern about Volusia County utilities potentially doing this is not there. Just wanted to make sure everybody understood from our perspective what we as a governmental body can control. We do not require that practice. In regards to the trail or Victoria Trails, and it was explained to me, and again, I'm glad our representative from DeLand is here, is that was an augmentation of their stormwater. So if the ponds drop below a certain level and they need it for irrigation, there's a meter on the reclaim, and the HOA has to pay for the reclaim to basically raise the level of the lakes so that they can use it for irrigation. If the lakes are at a sufficient level, that valve is closed and no water is flowing. So just wanted to make sure we had kind of a clear understanding going forward.
What I was going to add is the amount of volume of water that we get from a rain event versus the amount of volumes that I've heard discussed are vastly different numbers for the sizes of area that we're dealing with. The information I have is that there's 200 million gallons that got pumped into the development in a 90-day period. That's one of the claims that I was told. But that's over 100 acres of land, and that represents actually very little. Well, right. And these are the types of things I'm being told this is what's happening. I don't necessarily think that this is contributing the same level of issue as what we're being told it is. But I do think that if we just ignore the conversation on it,
Understood.
that then it allows these topics to be something that are discussed next week as justification for a moratorium rather than there being information with light put onto it. And so I think together as a team, especially, with Don able to help us, I think that there's a lot of information that we can bring forward for conversation today that can go to council next week. That's the timeliness element. Is I know that there's going to be a lot of conversations where a lot of information is put forward. And I think we have a responsibility to do a little bit of fact finding to help council with their very difficult task next week.
Ginger, and then I'd love to say something.
My comment isn't urgent if you would prefer to go first.
Mine may be derailing. I'll try for it not to be. Yesterday at the legislative delegation meeting, the cities spoke first, and almost all of them cited flooding as a huge issue for them, and it was part of their requests for funding things to deal with flooding. So it is a hot topic, and we know, just from our collective experience here, we know that a lot of the development that's being cited by regular citizens as the cause of flooding, we know that much of that development's taking place in cities rather than the county. I'm not going to get into how you do a moratorium or you don't do a moratorium. But as I went through the pre-read for Tyler's work here, and thank you for bringing this up, and also read a little bit about Venetian Bay in New Smyrna, where they've extended the moratorium, apparently, according to press reporting. I have no other insight than press reporting. They're saying either the design of the stormwater pond there was deficient, or the maintenance by the homeowners association is deficient. And as I went through the chapter 72 and as I went through all of that, I kept running up against the same thing over and over again, setting aside increases in rainfall and rising water tables, setting that very important factor aside, I kept running into an enforcement question. And I think that's also something that needs to be put out there. We don't like to pay for enforcement, but we may need to. And just one layperson's observations, like with what Tyler has heard speaking. Ginger, you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, just maybe a little context. And so, a lot of the background material that you were provided was related to reclaimed infrastructure and the county's goals around reclaim. And I just wanted to provide some background on that. And you probably noticed when you were looking at some of these are really old documents, right? Like for decades, we've been promoting this beneficial reuse of wastewater. And, the county and the cities are in a position where, particularly in our spring sheds, Blue Spring is the best example. We're under regulatory requirement to increase the flow of Blue Spring. And the way to do that is to find alternative sources of potable water so that we withdraw less from the spring shed. And so the county and the 5 municipalities that are within the Volusia Blue spring shed have to find other ways to meet the water needs. And so one of those other ways is an $80 million new water plant outside of the spring shed. One of the ways, and the way that the county and the cities have been really relying on for the last couple of decades, is to reduce reliance on potable water for irrigation by using reuse. And of course, when you think about like one water, you think the concept of one water, right? Like reuse water shouldn't be considered waste. It should be considered a resource. And so we and the cities have been moving toward, as much as possible, getting the wastewater, the water that's coming at the tail end of the wastewater plant back into the community beneficially. And so I just wanted to provide that as a little background to reuse is not a bad thing. Reuse is critical to the permitting of wastewater treatment plants, to the consumptive use permit, and to the ability to have folks have clean drinking water by not using that clean drinking water in the outdoor environment, right? So as the committee is thinking about, how do we deal with the reuse, right? Is it appropriate to require developers, which, I think Clay answered that we don't actually do this, require developers to hold it in ponds or something. I don't want us to get down the path of reuse being a bad thing. Reuse is a good thing. And at least in our case, that's advanced wastewater treatment level reuse coming out of those pipes. And Mike and his team and water resources and utilities have done an amazing job of getting lots of grant funding to upgrade those plants so that the water coming out the end is as low in nutrients as possible.
It's usually about
but it's a little
98% removal of the nutrients, in a properly operated plant of the non, exactly, correct. Yeah. Thank you, Ginger. And just as an aside, reclaim is used even for drinking water in Singapore and onboard spacecrafts. And if we clean it up enough and use it for irrigation, we don't have to put it into our water bodies to pollute. Anyway, Donna.
Hey, I'm not sure if you guys could hear me, but I lost audio again from you guys.
Oh, sorry. Do I need to repeat? Yeah, do I need to repeat that? Okay. All right.
99%
Shortened version. There are many reasons for flooding, not just the one or two that have been broadly blamed. And to the extent that we are able to distinguish what some of those are to inform the county council, I think we're doing a good job.
I'm going to throw this and go to Wendy in a second, but I want to throw this to Tad a little bit. I started making precisely that list for my letter to the council. And I don't know if it's a complete list. This group might come up with a really complete list, but on the agenda item for Tuesday, there is a notation that there's a staff report on things that staff is doing. I would imagine that staff is trying to identify, I have a feeling that this flooding is going to turn out to be site specific in many cases, rather than a universal cause of the flooding. And so each remedy will be a site specific remedy. I don't know if it's in our purview or ability to go geographically identify all that, but we can certainly ask if that's going to happen. And Clay's grinning, so I'm I don't know if Clay's grinning because he's
Thank you. So I too have been sort of sucked into this conversation with Mr. Mills and others in the Taylor Road, Jackson Woods area. And having previously been on the Victoria Park HOA board and the Victoria Park Community Council, and just to be clear, it's the Community Council that manages the irrigation and the stormwater system, not the HOA. Everybody always just says HOA as a sort of a blanket phrase, but it's not the HOA, it's the Community Council. Nonetheless, in 2022, I did a deep dive into our uses of reclaimed water across the neighborhood. I have all of the data in a multi-sheet workbook. The actual numbers of what Victoria Trails, which is the section of concern for the Taylor Road and Jackson Woods residents who are chronically flooded now, the range that Victoria Trails purchased in reclaimed water goes from 59 million to about 130 million gallons a year. Most of those purchases happen in March, April, and May when we are in the sort of warming and dry season. Less purchases later on as we're going into the rainy season. I appreciate Tyler's insight that these volumes, while they might sound like large numbers, are generally inconsequential compared to volumes of rainfall. Nonetheless, there is a perception from those neighbors that that is a problem. As I've pondered this some more, because again, I've been hearing this for about a year as well, and I'm trying to kind of wrap my head around this. I don't know that reclaimed water, I don't know that the source of the water matters. If irrigation is happening as it is happening in all of the new developments are designed with landscapes that need to be irrigated. It doesn't matter if you're pumping potable water. I mean, it matters in a conservation sense. But in terms of total volume, I don't think it matters if you're pumping potable groundwater, non-potable superficial aquifer, shallow well water, reclaimed water. The fact that the landscape requires irrigation means that more water is being brought into that locale than previous, unless it was in an agricultural system which also had irrigation, and so maybe it's, six one way, half dozen the other. But it doesn't matter that it's reclaimed. In the Victoria Trails and Victoria Park as a whole system, where they're actually holding the reclaimed water in ponds, yeah, that's happening. In Victoria Trails, the one and only pond where that water is held is not near the Jackson Woods area. It is, a good, I don't know, like 10th of a mile away. And I don't think that the groundwater flows north there. I think it generally flows to the south and the west. I'm looking at Tyler for validation on that. And so like where they're holding the reclaimed water there is not a source of flooding for them.
The ground saturation is what you're talking about with more water.
Yeah. So, again, being site specific, that is a closed, I'm going to say semi-closed basin. It's not entirely closed, but we're talking about it. We've been talking about it for 4 years as if it's a closed basin. And some very, very smart and highly revered engineers have identified it as a closed basin. We saw this past year that there is an overflow of that basin that comes out by way of Freedom Elementary and ends up at Blue Lake and in Westminster Woods. I mean, it's not a totally closed basin. It's just that there is a confining layer that holds the water there. Is adding 50 to 130 million gallons a year to that closed basin going to contribute to all the flooding? I don't think so. But I think a bigger question is, should we, as a county, be looking more at landscape solutions that require less irrigation regardless of the source? So our water-wise irrigation, our native plants, our, things that are embedded in low impact development. I mean, whatever language you want to use, to not have to irrigate a landscape after it is established is really should be the goal. And again, there's enforcement and there's maintenance. An HOA takes over a neighborhood and they're like, oh, we have to continue irrigating because we've always irrigated. Well, maybe you don't need to, and maybe the HOA needs to go back in and shut off their common area irrigation once those landscapes are mature. And so there's a lot of things here, but I've come kind of back to where I originally was, to believe it isn't even in the Taylor Road, Victoria Trails area. The input of reclaimed water is not the problem. I think we're on the same page there. It's not the problem, even in that particular site. So, and if we're going to have irrigation, it ought to be reclaimed if it's available and accessible, because that is better than using potable water. There might be some places where we want to use superficial groundwater if it's available to reduce phosphorus inputs. Yes, it's true, the nitrogen gets mitigated. One of the things, I'm going to go off and talk about nutrients for just a minute, if you'll allow me. One of the things we see happening in the Victoria Park ponds is that the reclaimed water gets brought in, gets stored. It comes in with minimal nitrogen, but it comes with lots of phosphorus. The phosphorus then stimulates cyanobacterial blooms, which are nitrogen fixers. And so they create they pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put more nitrogen into the ponds than what arrived from the city. And so, so we end up with these like green pea soup ponds that are just disgusting. That absolutely. So, so that's a completely different issue, but I guess having lived in Victoria Park, and I don't live there anymore for a number of reasons, including learning too much about this, is that I don't think, and this is kind of what Clay was saying a minute ago, I don't think storing reclaimed water inside of these neighborhoods is a good solution. And I'm glad that that hasn't become a sort of norm. So those are my insights on it, having been an insider on this particular location.
Thank you, Wendy. Donna, then Jessica, then John, then was Bill ahead of John or? Okay, then Bill, then John. Donna, Jessica, Bill, John.
Thank you.
Public.
I'm approaching the site-specific issue a little differently, just based on the work I've done with municipalities, both here and in Colorado. And yesterday, at yesterday's delegation meeting, yes, we heard a bunch of cities talk about this issue, but I think Senator Leek kind of zeroed in on one of the problems, and that was, in particular, he was speaking about Daytona, but I know it applies to Holly Hill as well, where their own infrastructure has not been upgraded and updated. And in fairness to this entire discussion, that has to be a factor. It has to be factored in, and the municipalities need to accept their measure of responsibility for fixing the problem too. It's not entirely on water providers and water users.
I was going to say, in the context that we're in today, where I think there's almost two discussions that's happening, right? There's, in general, what updates to the land development code or utility code do we see as important, and what can we do to address, I'm going to say, storm preparedness, right? Because I think a lot of the flooding, and there is some rainy day water retention concerns that have been brought up. Sunny day, I think I said rainy day. But the focus has been after storms, what the result has been. And so I think that if we, as we go through this discussion, if we say in general, here's some water-wise irrigation standards, and also maybe it would be a good idea to implement a rule that, you can't irrigate 7 days before a notice storm or something like that. Like maybe if we can separate those out in terms of how we're approaching things.
So this is, I'm very in favor of reuse and non-potable forms of irrigation, but I'm ignorant. So to get an order of magnitude, what is 100 million gallons a year on that acreage versus 54 inches a year that we get through a rainfall? Like, is it 100 inches? And then are we taking that water from the Floridan aquifer and putting it into a surficial aquifer unnaturally? So those two questions.
Second question again? I missed it. I'm
Are
sorry.
we taking the water from a Floridan aquifer that is from way deep and has a confining layer, and we're putting it onto a surficial aquifer?
The
Stacking.
reclaim you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Yes. Any even potable. So when
So-
you irrigate.
I think most of the potable water wells that are used for supply are not the deep aquifer, right? Because that water takes a lot more treatment, right? So we're talking about surficial aquifer water that goes to the water plant to be treated to be potable. Then it goes through your house, your body, whatever, comes back to the wastewater plant and gets treated, and then back out through reuse. So that's not like deep aquifer water being moved. Now we do, some places do deep well injection of that reuse water. We use rapid infiltration basins and the reuse network. But there are, of course, issues with sending that water deep into the aquifer as well, because, pharmaceuticals and nutrients and that sort of thing. But yeah, we're not moving it from one aquifer to the other that I'm aware.
Okay.
And just one quick point about the potable water source. If this was 20 or so years ago, we would be having the exact opposite conversation we're having right now. It wouldn't be too much water. It was not enough water, and we had ponds disappearing. We had lakes disappearing. So again, it's all part of the cycle that we're facing. I can tell you this much: when a utility provider goes for a consumptive use permit, St. John's is protecting the Floridan aquifer to the maximum extent, to the point, in a real world example, Ormond Beach was coming up for its consumptive use permit in the early 2000s. They were looking out west of 95. They were able to successfully get a grant from St. John's to use lower quality superficial aquifers east of I-95 by converting from lime softening as their method of treatment to reverse osmosis. So what you're seeing is there's a very distinctive and direct effort by the state regulatory and regional regulatory agencies to not go after the higher quality, more valuable aquifers such as the Floridan aquifer. And there's an incentive for utility providers to have better technology to improve the lesser quality water.
The order of magnitude.
Well, while Tyler is working through math in his head, I
got that answered. So 1 inch of rain is per acre equals 27,000 gallons of water. So multiply that by 100, 2.7 million on 100 acres for 1 inch of rain. 1 inch of rain equals 27,000 gallons per acre. That's ag. If you were on 100 acres, it's 2.7 million gallons for 1 inch.
that section is probably, I mean, the whole Victoria Park is almost 2,000 acres.
Oh.
And this is a quarter,
You're at 20.
but it's really, it's less than a quarter because it's chopped up. It's probably 250 to 300 acres. But the other way to look at it is the reclaimed plus stormwater that's being distributed 2 times a week to homeowners. Their clocks are set for it to deliver a quarter of an inch of irrigation to their lawns twice a week. So that would be 26 inches of irrigation that the lawns are being supplemented with twice. Just, yeah. Just the lawns, not the entire acreage of the development. And so is an additional 26 inches, and we have rain sensors, but they never work. And so, it irrigates in the rain and stuff like that. So, yeah, it's an additional 20 or so inches a year onto the lawns. Million. 540.
250 acres would be 6.8 million gallons per inch of rain.
So what did you say, Tyler? 5.4 million? Per inch of rain times 54. So 367 million is what normally falls out of the sky for that neighborhood versus 59 million coming in unreclaimed, 59 to 103. Yeah, third to a fifth.
So on the year with 130 million gallons, if it is 250 acres of area, that would represent about 19 inches of additional effective rainfall. So if I can jump in, one of the things that I did as research in the last month is I pulled all of the drinking well permit records for this particular basin. It took all of like 2 hours to do that. It sounds really impressive. And when a well is drilled, they break it into 20-foot segments and they identify the material type. So in this area, there is an extremely consistent 20 to 50-foot thick clay layer that starts somewhere around 40 to 60 feet below grade. So basically what we have is we have a giant bathtub that has a bunch of sand in it. And that sand is able to drain only a little bit at a time. So when we fill up that bathtub, the groundwater comes above the ground and we have a lake. And so the flooding that we're having is a lake. To me, one of the obvious answers to this could be, well, if we're adding 19 inches over that area, that actually could be contributing. That is about a third of our annual rainfall. Maybe we stop pumping water from below that layer to above that layer in areas that are flooding. And we require that if you're going to have irrigation, it be from a groundwater aquifer within, the top X feet of grade above any confining layer. Right. That's my opinion.
One, stormwater ponds in those areas are all wet ponds. So you have to keep them a certain elevation to avoid having an unsafe stormwater pond. We didn't really get into it in stormwater design too much, but when you have a wet pond, you have to keep at least a 4-to-1 slope for safety purposes in case somebody falls into the pond. They can be reasonably climbed, even with a inebriated condition or a health condition or something along those lines to get out. We designed those wet ponds such that they break from that 4-to-1 slope to a 2-to-1 slope, usually about 2 feet below the seasonal high elevation. And if they drop below that, now it's a 2-to-1 slope, and now it's no longer safe. While it is somewhat of a secondary condition, you do have that issue, and they are wet ponds in the first place. If you, when you're bringing in the reclaim water, it's just generally to supplement that. People are going to go ahead and water their ponds, unless you're talking about a long watering restriction. The water is going to be used, whether it's reclaimed to any point, whether it's reclaimed or potable, water is going to get added unless you tell them or force them to stop watering. So those gallons are going to be added to that basin. The 4-to-1 required if it's fixed? No. But there aren't too many subdivisions that want fences on their ponds. They're usually looking at it as an amenity. It's usually partially very adjacent to lots or community areas in the first place.
This kind of gets into groundwater fluctuates. We had a really long and complex discussion a few months ago where Tad and I and our geotech engineer friend all tried to explain that it is an exact science where we have to use a lot of judgment on how we set a seasonal high elevation. Part of the problem is you have a lot of existing infrastructure that's been designed around our current concepts. And in order for us to fix, quote unquote, what may be perceived as problems with those existing systems would require a level of reconstruction or redesign of how they are built so that they can operate under the new quote unquote design concept. So Tad's not wrong. We can't just let the pond levels drop. That's the reason that they're filling them. I somewhat have a disagreement that I would rather see us fill the pond bottoms to where we have a 4-to-1 slope or fence the ponds or in some other way allow us to actually let that groundwater continue to drop down, continue to pump from that groundwater for irrigation. But that's the point of me tying these two things together is we do have water that we use for our potable water use that gets sent to our treatment plants. And that water has to go somewhere. Under our current design ideology, at least City of DeLand and most of Volusia County, we use reclaimed water for irrigation as a way to dispose of that water. We have to meet higher treatment standards, and this is where my level of intelligence gets to below a 5th grader, and I need Michelle to speak up on any technical items, but we have to treat it at a much higher quality if we're going to discharge it to the St. Johns River or discharge it to an aquifer. The permitting process becomes much more complicated and challenging for the utility agencies, but those are reliable discharge points versus irrigation. And so my personal opinion is that that investment and that effort is worth it in a bigger context, but I don't know what that looks like. That's just a judgment without knowing the total cost. But I do think that irrigation restrictions from aquifer-based water is something that we should consider, whether it's reclaim or potable. I think that it has implications in some of these basins on the flooding.
Thank you. So before we go on to Michelle to answer some of those questions, pardon? Oh, okay, John, then Michelle, then. We started this conversation and the room felt like we were all thankful to Tyler for bringing this up in a timely matter before the meeting next Tuesday. But we're also supposed to be working on the land development codes. That's our remit, and we're stepping a little bit outside it to analyze, although personally, I think this is a very important conversation. I'm trying to figure out how we turn this, and I wasn't kidding about a whiteboard, if we're stepping outside our normal remit and saying, how can we be of assistance to the council? Maybe we do need to make a list of all these different things that have come up in our meetings that we're concerned about and that we're continuing to look at. Or do we look at these codes and try to rewrite them? I'm just trying to get us down to something actionable. We got the whiteboard, I know. I had to move it to plug in my computer. So I'm just looking for what we can do that is taking an action that ends up from this with an action. Because I think the discussion is hugely valuable, but it has to translate to something, no?
Yeah.
So I've listened to different things. We're concerned about your basin and the trails, and we're concerned about all the different scenarios that happen. And, you know, I think Donna said it best that we have all these different inputs that create flooding. And Jessica's mentioned preparedness as well. And I guess before you even get into how deep the water is how deep of water do you accept as a common occurrence versus what is truly flooding? Because there's a lot of areas, Daytona Park Estates, that flood and have flooded and will continue to flood no matter what you do. And then you have the areas of where we've overbuilt or we have problems with not understanding the underlying resistance that of the ground soaking in the water. And then you have historical rainfalls of 1,000 years or 500 years. But where do you start? I mean, where is it become truly flooding of concern versus flooding of a magnitude level that we have to address? And, you know, so I'm just posing that out there more than anything else, because we could talk about scenarios all day long.
That's what we talked about the last meeting, though, in a way, when
Right.
we revisited what design storm. I learned that term.
But what's the threat level that we're really concerned with, is my question.
And I think that, you know, maybe Tad wants to jump in, but I've heard Ben Bartlett talk about, you know, that traditionally the way that they've looked at flooding is, are structures being flooded, right? Are people's homes or businesses being flooded? And I think, you know, that's one way to look at it. I think that's partly like how our emergency management, the other thing that I think is important to this committee is, you know, are areas being flooded that there are environmental consequences for? For instance, Daytona Park Estates is a great example. in many cases, those homes aren't flooded, but if their yards are flooded, that means their septic tanks are not operating, right? So that you see the lady with the video walking around in her squishy yard, that is septic tank water she's walking around in because that septic tank has failed. And so, I think there are sort of two different things. There are the structures flooding and are people being endangered in that way and their investments being endangered. There's also the environmental consequences of flooding areas where we don't have central services for wastewater.
John, do you have an additional?
I think,
Jessica?
I have a,
I've been up.
I'm sorry, I missed you. It was actually Michelle first because she was after John. Sorry about that.
I
Then
have
Donna,
so many
then you.
thoughts, so I don't even know where to begin. But will say there's also other solutions too for stormwater, because you could always pump stormwater, right? Not like the best solution. You try to use gravity and more economical solutions, but a lot of the stormwater and flooding, I believe, is still always going to be specific to each basin or that particular area. Ben Bartlett said they're doing the studies, right? So when those basin studies come, that's going to tell us a lot of information. That'll help, staff and everybody identify where do we have to target and what do you have, and then kind of drill down. When it comes to the regs, I think we could take another look at them with all these thoughts now and try to come up with what's important, right? So we have maintenance, standards, preparedness, so I think that's kind of maybe where we head moving forward is kind of my thoughts for now. Yeah.
Okay, then to John's point about threat levels, that is also site specific. And I have absolutely no idea how to write policy that addresses every possible scenario. And if that's our charge, I'm going to have to leave it to the rest of you and hear what makes sense. But we are clearly so diverse in the source of the threat that I'm a little bit confused about where to start to write policy that addresses it.
Jessica?
so I was going to say to your comment, Melissa, on, we're having the discussion, where does it lead? I think the introduction to water usage and irrigation, it's kind of like when we do our primers on topics, right? On the background before we look at changes. And I think that out of that discussion, we do eventually narrow down to the key points that we want to see in the regulations. And we may want to spend time on the current regulations in a bit as it relates to the potable and irrigation and reclaim. But in the course of where we are now, kind of this discussion on flooding and water usage, I agree it's site specific. On risk, I also agree that there has to be a level where we acknowledge in the contract world with attorneys, it's something nobody can control, nobody plans for. I think that there are individuals in our community who are deeply impacted by preventable flooding, and that's one set of items that we should address, and it could be through basin plans or regulations that just in general increase capacity in our system before storm events, and that are just best practices for nutrient reduction and things like that. But I think that another part of it is that we recall that hurricanes are acts of God, and you shouldn't be able to go to Publix 2 hours after a hurricane ends. There's going to be water on the roads. You're supposed to shelter in place, let emergency vehicles get out. So that's all part of, I think, education, because we did hear heartbreaking stories during the storm. We also heard stories that said there was water in the road, and those are very distinct and I think have to be treated differently. This started with just a question on the septic, which is, is there a limitation on use of septic in floodplains currently?
Not in floodplains per se. It's based on the depth to water table, and it's as permitted by the Department of Health, which that's now shifting over to DEP. So it's not a geographic restriction. It's a site specific, what's the water table like at your site issue. And then if you have a depth to water table issue, you can mound that drain field and still get a septic permit.
And then just, just between what reality is and what law is, for instance, on the North Peninsula, which I'm familiar with, lots of old housing stock, all septic systems, the most densely septic systemed area in all of Volusia County, and one that is not prone to flooding, except for road flooding on John Anderson. We had people with mushy yards too, because the septic systems are grandfathered, and people either do not maintain their systems properly because it costs money to replace a drain field, or they don't have them pumped out. Or when they do go to replace their drain field, they're allowed to replace it. If their home was built before 1984, they're allowed to replace it much closer to it doesn't have to be as deep, let me put it that way. It can be closer to the water table. And so if you're building a new house, you have to mound in a lot of places on the North Peninsula, but you don't if you're replacing old systems. And I'm going to imagine that that's replicated all around the county when the health department was dealing with this anyway.
It
that-
depends. Sorry.
Just 2 quick points. There's stormwater and then there's floodplain.
Mm-hmm.
Every development that comes through has to address stormwater, but not every development that comes through has to address floodplain. So if you don't have floodplain on your property, you're not an issue from that perspective. In regards to new developments coming in, we do have in our floodplain ordinance the prohibition against locating developments in a manner that would have a negative impact to those areas. So we do have some regulatory teeth. Is it as perfect as an outright prohibition? Not necessarily, because the folks who live in the legal world tell us about takings and things like that. So we have to be cognizant of that. But yes, for new development, and Ms. Lammers hit it straight on the head. We have a lot of projects that were approved prior to 1983. Is everybody aware that St. John's River Water Management District was not issuing permits until 1983 throughout the district? And so, and those were the old MSSW permits that were out now. So that just kind of gives you an indication. In 1983, we were about half the population we are now. So we still had a considerable amount of our population going through not having stormwater provisions that we have currently, nowhere close with the floodplain requirements. And that's why you have Daytona Park Estates and other similar projects, Cape Atlantic Estates down near Edgewater. Those are all areas that have floodplain, that have wetlands, are low lying, have close, the groundwater table very close to the surface. And none of them have a stormwater plan. None of them have stormwater facilities. So these are the areas that have vested development rights because they met that litmus test for at least the unincorporated area of having a valid subdivision by 1976 that are able to continue to develop. And that's where we have to issue building permits and allow for the septics and the wells on 75 by 150 foot deep lots in Daytona Park Estates.
And we can't fix that here. Can
Well-
we? This committee?
That's more of a policy direction from the county council in regards to what they feel is appropriate for special assessments to address infrastructure deficiency.
Ginger.
I just wanted to expand a little bit on Jessica's question. The only place that I know in the county that we have geographic restrictions on where septic tanks can go is in our Class 2 area. So, south of New Smyrna Beach, east of US 1, we have an ordinance that directs where the septic can go on the lot. But if it's a vested lot and there's no central service available, not allowing some type of wastewater system, a on-site wastewater system would be considered a taking. The other thing is that the state is now enforcing in a way that they haven't in the past for replacements of septic tanks in certain areas, in the springs in particular, but it really is going to apply to any basin that has a basin management action plan where nutrients are the contaminant of concern. They're directing that upon replacement or repair of a septic system, they have to be nitrogen reducing. So it doesn't completely eliminate that system, but it does attenuate some of the nitrogen. So making progress in that area, but even if it's a nitrogen reducing system, if it gets flooded, it's not working. So, and then I just wanted to address really quickly, and I hopefully not talking out of turn, talking about how do we bring this back to the things that are the purview of this committee. I think that certainly if there's a will of the committee to look at the landscape and irrigation standards, if when we provided the water-wise landscaping ordinance, if that's not sufficient, you want to talk about that, that's a way to do it. And then I think, we all have a tendency to think about how do we fix the problems that we have, but because this committee is looking at codes that are looking to the future, right? What does the next development have to comply with? That, maybe we be thinking about where we should be permitting development and where we shouldn't, or if you're permitting development in areas that are vulnerable to flooding or other hazards, that maybe there are different standards. And so I think that, we have on our list, flood hazard management. I think, that's a great place to look at. Should we be permitting buildings with septic systems in areas that we know are going to flood, right? Those sorts of things. And then looking at that Indian River Lagoon overlay, also that's our class 2 area if we wanted to do that. So I think there are some places that this could come in, and it would be a regulatory tie versus some of the stuff that the public works folks are looking at with their basin studies and how to fix some issues that we have right now.
So with that said, are we ready to look at our work plan and decide? Tyler, I'm sorry. Did you go ahead?
I was going to just kind of answer the question to the pain threshold. I personally don't think that we're going to find agreement within the community on what level of flooding is acceptable. I don't want my yard flooding, so I bought a house that I knew wouldn't flood. There's a lot of people that don't want their yard flooding. They buy a house, their yard floods, and then what do? They're in pain and they're coming to the council meeting. I don't want to tell them that it's unreasonable. It's just they might have made a mistake that led to them. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that can lead to that, and so I don't think we get into a productive conversation when we go down that route. I'm an engineer. I like to solve problems, so I'm looking at this from what are the things that we as a community can encourage the council to do? We as a committee advising council, what can we encourage them to take action on that can improve the recurrence of flooding or reduce the recurrence of flooding in our community? And I think that we've identified a lot of those already at our prior meetings. But one of the areas that we have not talked about at all is how we move water around as a community, both for drinking water, for irrigation water, for other things. And I do think that that's an area that affects flooding. And I do think it's a lever that the council should, in these basin plans, be considering. And whether that means that you have xeriscaping requirements because we just can't tolerate irrigation within an already flood-prone basin, or whether it means that you have different plans long-term for how to deal with that reclaimed water. I think we have some short-term and some long-term changes that we as a community are going to come into agreement that need to happen. But as our role as an advisory council or an advisory committee to the council, I see it as important that we do actually look at what are the codes that we have in place, make a statement that, hey, we think that all of this is really positive that we already have in place. You have these upcoming efforts that are going to look at what can the county take as actions. So that's not our committee, but what can they take as actions? We also think you need to include these other elements in those studies because there's been a lot of conversation of it. But if you just do a stormwater flood study, I mean, I've never considered irrigation in any stormwater flood study of any kind that I've ever performed. It's like, this is I don't want to say a new concept, but this is an idea that hadn't come to me as a contributing cause until I started really listening to the comments. So that's my position on it. It's not that we're picking a level of pain that we can and can't live with. I think Donna's completely correct that there's so many factors that this is a case by case evaluation, but there needs to be some guidance and some boundaries of what are the things that are important for us to look at. And so that's the timeliness of it to me. And that's also the purpose behind it.
And it's also a more holistic, which the statutes are not holistic, but as you said, that's an element that we had not considered as a factor. Clay, you've had your name tag up. Okay. Ginger. All right. So are we ready to look at our work plan then and continue? Because that would be a good deliverable to have. And the other I'm sorry, following up a little on Tyler. Tyler's said this several times, to make recommendations to the council. We speak through the ordinances. We don't go to them and say, unless we do it in our private capacities, look, all these things. We do our ordinances one at a time, right? We've done LID, we've done stormwater. I'm personally very pleased that those will go to the council together, hopefully. What Clay was saying at the beginning, that makes all the sense in the world. Imagine that. But we don't go in and make a recommendation and say we need to look at all these things. All these things are contributing factors and we're working on them. We just speak to them through the ordinances. And I guess that's the only way we can, correct?
I mean, that's the committee is charged with making recommendations to the council on the
Yep.
environmental minimum standards and the land associated, implementing ordinances. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that the committee could come up with some great idea that's not exactly an ordinance thing. Like Tyler's saying, okay, we're doing these basin studies. Let's not forget to look at this thing.
And he's talking
there's
about water.
Yeah, I think there's a way to get those comments to the staff that would need them, and then that could bring up, right? I mean, Tad's here. We've talked to Ben, right? I don't know that that's like you would stand up in front of council and say, well, this isn't in our purview,
Yeah.
but I think you should think about this. But that could happen where you guys come up with great ideas, and those could just go to the staff, kind of outside of a normal like presentation to the council.
Thank you. Okay, work plan. Would someone like to move that the work plan be approved as presented? Or something else? Donna. Donna moves that the work plan be approved as presented. Do we have a second? We have a second, Michelle Whittick. Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye. Any opposed? Motion carries and our work plan for 2025 is approved.
Bliss, I just wanted to make sure you're still there and if you voted on that motion. I don't think I muted her, but I can try. I didn't.
I'm here.
Okay, and did you vote for that motion?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we are at what time is it? 2:18 mark. Is this a good moment?
I'd like some clarity if
Okay.
that's okay, in terms of our next steps. So our next meeting will be in the beginning of February, which would be before the council would hear the LID and stormwater ordinances. So I guess I'm wanting to know what you want to be prepared to do at that meeting. If we're tackling stormwater management minimum standards as our first priority, we lost Tad, but I think the way to do that is to look at what I don't know. I'm torn. We won't know what council thinks about what you've proposed for the Chapter 72 yet. We could take what you has been proposed but not heard, and it will have been to PLDRC by then, so we'll have some feedback. We could take that implementing ordinance and sort of back into the chapter 50, right? Basically what we'd be looking at is what standards do we want to apply in all the cities, right? Because now we've said, here are the standards we want to apply in the unincorporated area. And we'd be looking sort of, okay, now what do we want to apply in the cities as part of the minimum standard? We can do that at the next meeting based on what has been put forth already, but not yet knowing what the council has voted for. So I'll say that. Alternatively, and I probably should have brought this up before we made the motion and all that, we could continue the discussion about landscape and irrigation and stuff. And I guess my question is, sorry, I'm not being very clear. Do you want to tackle the stormwater minimum standards before you hear from the council about the stormwater land development code changes?
I want to add to this conversation that we are about to embark on, that all of us have to remember that we are now moving into countywide minimum standards, which is very different in terms of who they will apply to than what we did for Chapter 50, because minimum standards now become something that, if adopted in a revised format, become imposed on all of the cities. And so we have to understand that. And then secondly, we all live in different areas and may or may not have seen personal and or neighborhood issues associated with stormwater and flooding. But to me, as I think about tackling that topic, which I personally, I'm okay with starting it because I don't see us doing anything fast except for maybe today. I feel like I also need to hear, and I don't know how this happens, what have the cities been experiencing and or doing? I know my area, but that's, one of 16 cities. And so somehow in moving forward on minimum standards, we have to think through what is happening outside the unincorporated area and what are they doing already, that may or may not be something to mimic in a minimum standard, because we have heard a long time ago when we first got started that some cities have something more rigorous than otherwise. So I think some of that we have to think about, how do we get that information and understand it before we start tackling. And I sure don't want us moving forward without some way of communicating and sharing and inviting, we have a gentleman today from City of DeLand listening to us. That's great. But you start tackling a minimum standard and that has the potential to, blow up, not in a good way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sarah Lee. Clay and then Jessica.
Sarah Lee provides a great segue. We have checked all 16 cities currently meet our minimum requirements. If you go back to when these were originally implemented, they had till 1997 to have in place in their ordinance equal to or more restrictive stormwater standards. A review that I conducted about a month ago shows that all of them comply with that minimum requirement, no problem. There's actually quite a few, including the city of New Smyrna Beach and DeLand, that have made amendments that incorporate additional standards specifically for some of the closed basin and some of the other aspects of it. So we will be able to report to you in kind of a matrix, kind of showing the critical design elements and whether or not that are contained in Chapter 50. We should be able to do that to you for you at the February meeting, kind of go through what y'all want to do. And then at that point, I think we could send it out to the 16 cities and ask them for them to provide their comments on the, again, just taking the changes y'all have recommended for 72, crafting them for chapter 50, because because it is chapter 50. We have to coordinate with all 16 cities before we do anything at all. There's a minimum 30-day notification requirements. The earlier we can do it and the more time that we can provide to them, I think would be better.
Thank you, Clay. Jessica, Wendy, then Tyler.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm
what was,
last.
okay, where were you relative to, because Jessica has been up for a while. Okay, thank you.
Oh, I think that knowing this group and assuming, which you know what they say about that, but assuming some discussion that will happen on the 14th, that our first meeting in February will really be a recap of that discussion. I think that this board ends up being a clearinghouse, even if we're not necessarily the best posed for some of the discussions. And so I think that if we can focus on here's why minimum standards are different, procedurally, how we're going to approach that, and that overview of the municipalities, in addition to an update on the flooding and stormwater discussion that happens on the 14th, I believe that we'll be well in hand to fill our time.
Yep. I'm in favor of doing a brushstroke approach to minimum standards, especially because the council is going to be reviewing them. I think prior to, it's good for us to have the knowledge. And I think it's good for us to be able to understand where we need to go as a committee, what recommendations we may need to make or anything like that. So I'm in favor of doing that.
Bill? So just mechanically, two questions. One, the cities currently meet the minimum standard, right? Not the new proposed.
Correct.
Okay. And then mechanically, will they have to, once we and Volusia County approves the chapter 50 changes, they have to go through their own rulemaking?
Yes. And what you saw is that Volusia County basically came up with the standards starting in 1995 and gave the cities till 1997 to get it adopted. So we would have to talk about the time frame. Again, the majority of the changes that y'all made to Chapter 72 were very technically oriented. And so therefore, I don't see that as a major stumbling block, just in my own personal opinion, because it's going to be a situation where people like Don at DeLand is going to look and say, yeah, this makes sense, or no, it doesn't, and feed back to us. And again, they have the option to be more restrictive. So it just kind of sets in motion the discussion of what we've already have in place.
Wendy, then Donna.
I'm in no position to speak for the cities, but just as an observer of many of the city commission meetings since last fall, I think, every city is dealing with this, and I think they are eager to find solutions. And I think I've also heard a lot of rhetoric from people across the county that it is time for the county and the cities to work more collaboratively to find solutions. So I think if we can participate in that by offering up some technical options for those roundtables to consider, it would be us doing our part to help with that. I'm looking at the diagram that F-Card sent around this past week, and the very first item on this is establish a stormwater roundtable. I don't know what they mean by that. There's just a short description, but I'm assuming that would have representatives from each of the cities in the county as well as from other stakeholder groups. And so, yeah, I think if we can offer up some suggestions from this committee to those countywide conversations, it would be useful.
Thank you. Donna, then,
Sorry, just before we do that, we do have a new participant, and I muted him briefly, but how do I unmute you?
Yeah, Sean Weinberger, our environmental compliance manager, is going to log in for me. I have to be at City Hall at 3 o'clock for another meeting. Believe it or not, it's basically the same issue, flooding. We have an issue with Victoria Park and city manager and a few other staff members. So Sean's going to take over for me.
Well, thank you very much for joining.
You're welcome.
Donna and Wendy, are you coming back again? Or is it Tyler, Donna, then Tyler?
This is mainly I think for procedural clarity, and I think it relates to Bill's question. So in imposing new minimum standards on cities, does this effectively require them to up their systems if they need to do that in order to meet our new minimums? Do we have the authority to do that? And how does this fit with home rule cities?
I'll let Clay answer that.
Under the county charter, the state of Florida has established such that counties can establish charters and identify specific roles that they can do. Volusia County's charter allows us to establish minimum environmental standards that go into the cities. Other counties such as Broward and Pinellas have similar type of rules and regulations. It would not necessarily pertain to the infrastructure that the city maintains per se. It would pertain solely to the rules and regulations they utilize for their stormwater management ordinances. So they already have on the books standards that comply with our current Chapter 50. If this group recommends a series of changes that are consistent with Chapter 72, mechanically we would send that out once we've got blessing from the council to do so. They would then have 30 days to review those, make comment, get back to it, and then depending on what the comments were, the county council would have to take final action on that ordinance. Then there would be a set time frame for those cities to amend their ordinances to be in compliance with our updated Chapter 50. Those are all allowed under the charter 202.4 of the charter. Is that correct? And so it is a common practice that we've utilized here in Volusia County. We recently did something of a similar nature to Chapter 50 for our beaches and dunes permit, about 4 years ago, 5 years ago? So it is not impeding on their home rule.
Jack.
You got it.
Oh, Tyler, then Jack. And Ginger, are you in queue?
So I think definitely it's a good idea for us to get into Chapter 50 next month. Most of the suggestions that we're sending to council for Chapter 72 are pretty minimal. There's a couple of them that may have controversy at a Chapter 50 level, but overall, I think they're common sense things that address some failures that have occurred. I think there's more that we can actually get into in discussion that's going to be unpopular with the cities and so on and so forth, and that we just all have to be measured and recognize that this is the rule for everybody. But I am for this.
Jack, then Jessica, then Sarah Lee.
Yeah, I was kind of going there. I'm very interested in the gaps between what we're suggesting as minimums and what the cities have in place now. And if that gap is larger and the significance of the discussion may be better. So maybe this next meeting, we get into those differences. But I'm happy to hear that a lot of them are minimal because that makes them easier to implement. And perhaps it means we're not going far enough. But I think it does call for the next meeting to be kind of a recap of where we are and perhaps a grid that says, okay, here's what we're recommending and here's how far away that is for each municipality as they are, because then we can say, well, is that reasonable and actually get ahead of it instead of suggesting it and then them coming back and saying that's unreasonable. It's a little more proactive approach.
Thank you, Jack. Sarah Lee, then Jessica.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna say something that piggybacks on Jack. I want to make sure that not necessarily the next meeting. I understand what I think sounds really good for the next meeting, but perhaps soon thereafter. I want it to be collaborative. I don't want it to be something where, you know, when I hear this 30 days, you have 30 days to review. You know, and when you get something like that and you feel like that really doesn't mean input. You know, I want to make sure that we as an advisory committee approach it in a way that allows for input before we send something to council.
I agree with you, Shirley, on that. My comment was going to be more on, Wendy noted the V card recommendations on flooding mitigation, which typically we couldn't talk about. So if we want to talk about it at the end, we can. But I think that when we talk about what the role of this committee is versus a lot of the hats that everybody on this committee wears outside of this room, it's literally of me, I guess, but most of it reduces down to an ordinance. And so there are aspects and kind of the recommendations and work plan that we may not think of, right? The collaborative board meeting between local government and their technical staff being one, which you mentioned, but also, you know, somewhere on there, there's updates on infrastructure needs. And if you boiled it down, there could be a minimum standard that says on a biannual 5-year basis, local governments have to submit their priority needs, you know, list for stormwater infrastructure, just some way to share information. That's a regulation, but it leads to the collaboration and kind of the policy building. So I think there's a way for us to work through that too.
Is this an appropriate break moment?
It is,
May I
although
ask a question or make a statement first?
Yes, Bliss.
Thank you. While we're on this, talking about minimum standards and, I heard what Sarah Lee and Jack both had to say, and Jessica, I would, also like to add that, you know, instead of just a response, some of the smaller cities are understaffed and may need some, technical assistance from the county, understanding, everything in conjunction with what they are trying to do. So I just wanted to put that out there that I think the county may be needed to assist some of the cities.
Thank you.
So we need to allow time for that.
I think now is a perfect time for a break, although I will point out that I believe we covered everything on our agenda. So it may be a break until next month, if that's okay.
That would be a first. Wouldn't that
I
kick the new
know.
year off interestingly?
If there's more discussion, I absolutely, we're not, you know, we have time, but
I recognize Michelle.
Just wanted to make a comment though. So all these new ordinances would be for new developments. A lot of the flooding issues are the existing developments. So then what are the mechanisms that we could use to help rectify the existing developments to address the flooding? I think that's the silver bullet that I still can't figure out is how do we do that?
Can I? I think the challenge, and Donna mentioned it based on some comments yesterday at the legislative session. I think one of the challenges that we have societally, I don't care if we're talking the cities or the counties, or let's leave Volusia and go somewhere else and have the same conversation, is we have areas that have been developed without infrastructure as we know it today and without regulations as we know it today. And in some of those instances, you know, there are no good solutions. There's only expensive solutions. And that is certainly not this committee's charge, right? We're regulatory. And in the times we're living in right now where nobody wants to spend any money on anything, you know, it's really hard for local government, especially, but even, you know, state and higher up to come up with enough money to address individual and neighborhood and regional concerns that are largely either infrastructure based or individual homes, that need rebuilt, or perhaps, there's 3 homes together that should now be a basin, a pond. Those are, to me, this is the easy work, the regulatory work. And the concern that I think some of us have is that a moratorium does not address the problem that is, quite frankly, way more extensive.
Then Michelle, then Wendy. Thank you.
The question about basically a coordinated public works effort to identify those deficiencies has been identified by the roundtable of elected officials as a critical element. Mayor Paritsky from the town of Ponce Inlet is the chairman of that committee, and she has asked for that to be on the next available agenda. And again, those of you who may not remember, we used to have a League of Cities organization that disbanded. The roundtable of elected officials has taken that place, and that's basically where we're seeing the coordination efforts really being spearheaded. So therefore, as been mentioned by many of the members on this board, every city in Volusia County, I think, is mentioned. I hate saying it, every city in all of Florida is grappling with this issue. And so there is now a effort from that group to put in place that coordination element amongst the cities and the county in regards to flooding, stormwater facilities, maintenance, etc.
Michelle took her card down, so Wendy. We didn't respond to you.
So, so yes, everything that Sarah Lee and everybody else has said, just second all of that, yeah, it's expensive and the work that we're doing is not retroactive. I did like what, I don't know, Melissa or somebody else said a little while ago, that it could be an ordinance that cities are required to do a review of their infrastructure and see what is needed to update. And and again, that was a piece of this. If we're maybe going to forego a break and just maybe visit for another 20 minutes before we depart. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, I do find it interesting, what F-Card sent out. And, and I would like to point out that they feature supporting a hybrid LID structure. They feature avoiding and minimizing wetland impacts. Some things that we have talked about and been supportive of, although we don't have our wetlands ordinance going forward just yet. I think that this is an interesting framework that they've presented. I don't necessarily agree with all of their sort of funding proposal pieces of it, but I think that this might be it might be interesting to spend a few minutes to sort of respond to this and see if there's anything about this proposal that informs the work we have to do, given how influential V-Card is in policy development.
Is that a motion?
I move that we spend a few minutes to review this.
So maybe a break is in order and then come back and.
There you go.
Are you leaving? Okay, because, all right. Well, you'll just have to live with what we do. Friends, Romans, and countrymen, I'm calling the meeting back to order, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. Could I ask your indulgence in going back to something, please, for just a moment? At one of our very first meetings, Wendy brought up a frustration that I think we've all had, and that is we get into topics like water, and it's related to many of the other topics, but we have to deal with it discreetly. Each each set of laws we deal with discreetly, and sometimes something we learn as we're talking about one set of ordinances makes us think back to another ordinance. Tyler went broad today. He said, I want to talk about water. And I found this other bit of water that we haven't been discussing, and it's reclaimed water, irrigation water. That's another input of water onto the land. Well, we talked about something at our last meeting, and it kind of fell short, I think, because of the discussion of the basin studies that are going to be undertaken. And at this meeting, we're talking about hearing from the cities. But I know from other organizations that I'm part of and things that I read that we are having changes to our groundwater levels as well. And we're only addressing that from a boring position. We're not, we did reexamine as a body our design storms, but we didn't talk about where that water table is predicted to be. And we had the opportunity to say, hey, we want to hear from some people. So if we're hearing from the cities, do we want to hear from some outside expertise or what other counties might be doing near us? I don't know what information's out there of adjacent counties, but it seems to me that if we're really trying to grapple with the problem of water, too much of it and not enough of it, because those are both two sides of the same coin, why would we ignore what's going on underneath the ground? So that's just throwing that out there while we're inviting people to come talk to us. Mr. Light.
What are you suggesting?
I'm suggesting we go back to calling in some expertise, outside expertise, like we did for the borings. We had an engineer come in, Dr. Anderson.
I definitely think there's some value in hearing from some other counties that have grappled with this perhaps longer than we have. And, and whether that's asking staff to review what they do or to invite some, some experts from other counties, that would be useful. And then I do love that we're now thinking about both superficial and kind of deep aquifer water resources and, their impacts on flooding as well as, as a resource and in other regards. And so I don't want us to ignore that. And I don't know if that means we need to have somebody come in from St. John's or if we need to have, hydrologists come in and talk to us about that. But yeah, I do think that that's a really important perspective that we've been ignoring.
Ginger, do you have an opinion on or Samantha, as you've gone to different resilience shindigs?
Yeah, so work is being done in other counties, right? Folks in South Florida have been dealing with this longer than us, and they've done some different things than we do related to groundwater and rainfall. There are other areas that are looking at, what is the predicted future rainfall? So not designing to the current rainfall, right? Because the standards we use right now from USGS are from 2013. Rainfall patterns have changed. So Samantha had a good point that the Regional Planning Council has done good work at least on the rainfall piece. Yeah, and so we could get somebody from the Planning Council to come in and talk about some of the other work that they've done and work that other counties have done, because they, similarly to how they've helped us, they've helped other municipalities and counties. So we could reach out to them and see if they have some input.
Would that be amenable? Mr. Hobble.
I think it would be important, and I know you suggested St. John's Water Management District, but I think maybe looking at a long-term and a short-term historical perspective of the hydrology in this county over the past 10 to 50 years to see what those levels and that little bit of science that comes into play. And is there something that is alarming or concerning by those numbers as well? I think experts are good for helping us make good decisions.
Thank you. So what I understood from John is maybe it would be good to hear from two groups, from both the Regional Planning Council and maybe from the district. Wendy?
I alluded to this earlier. I am really curious, and I'm looking across at John. When you convert land from a fernery or an orange grove or pasture land to a subdivision, you know, acre by acre, how much more or less water is being drawn to support that land use? Not just for yeah, and not just for irrigation, but for the domestic use as well. And, you know, because that is kind of going into the entire, you know, kind of basin recirculation and not necessarily ever making it back to the deep aquifer. So,
So there is some probably good information from St. John's on that because they do permit and they do monitor your usage in agriculture, because especially in the high water use caution areas, there are some good data, I'm sure, that's available there. But and knowing the state of the agriculture industry over the past 10 years, we've seen a decline probably more in agricultural production in this county than we have an increase. And so that consumption is down from the withdrawal standpoint. And the thing that always concerned me as an ag producer is we always got charged or accused of our withdrawals, especially this time of year when you're freeze protecting and those kind of things. But you always got damned for the withdrawals, but you never got any credit for the recharge. And all these farms are on well-drained sandy soils, which is ideal for growing. And it's an interesting side of just not just urban and, you know, public use, but that agricultural side is an interesting study as well.
That is
And we
interesting.
can look into that. So Sam and I were just whispering about maybe some places to find some of that information. The Program for Resource Efficient Communities at UF does some research on those sorts of issues. The other thing is that the DEP, when they're assigning water quality allocations for water quality reduction, they have it's a nitrogen model, but basically they're modeling pollution and they also are modeling consumption based on land use. And so we may be able to, and the Water Management District does a lot of consumption modeling based on land use. So there may be some of that out there. Well, there's certainly some of it out there. Whether we want to do all that at the February meeting or we want to like tackle some of it, let us do some research and find out the right people. You know, maybe it may be a following meeting, but I think there's really good work happening out there, and to the extent that we can find it, and whether or not the expert can come and talk about it, or whether, you know, we can have a small presentation, you know, if the staff has to do it or whatever, I think we could do that.
Personally, and John articulated it really well. I like the idea again of grounding ourselves in some regional knowledge and taking it from there. And maybe it's a multiplicity of sources, but I'd certainly love particularly to hear from at least one of them at the next meeting.
Yep, we'll work on that.
Okay. Jessica, do you want to walk us through your V card?
Like, sure, absolutely. Sure, we can. So this was sent out with a little bit more detail beyond it. I know that this is the publicly available infographic to county council members from VCARD's technical review committee. It is a snapshot of potential flooding mitigation strategies to be explored. There's a little more detail in the backup for each, but in general, there are ideas brought together either by just our members with expertise in the area that volunteer to the technical board. So I'll run through them very quickly, give kind of the main insight, and then we're happy to talk about it more. The first is establish a stormwater roundtable. So that was really focused on, like we said, getting everybody in the room together. So similar to what you see with the TPO, where you've got a local government body who reviews and discusses these items. Like Clay said, I think that the elected official roundtable is looking at serving in kind of that capacity and are already talking about it. And then here it says utilize LMS, which is I think local mitigation strategy, which is a board created to deal with FEMA funding, mostly. Local mitigation strategy. It's got staff members from each local government that come together and talk about funding priorities for storm damage. I think that using that baseline and expanding that out to create a dual function board where you have the elected officials and policymakers and you have the technical expertise of staff talking about regional issues and coordinated efforts, whether it's using existing funding, looking at grant funding, whatever it becomes, and even talking about policy. I think it's important to all talk to each other because you've got boards like us who are trying to piece together what all 16 cities do and what they need. That's one. I think it's honestly the one that has the most potential of the 10 of getting solutions for existing problems. The next one is adoption of a flooding mitigation fund. There are a lot of ways to do that. We've talked about it, sales tax, a millage like Volusia Forever, special assessment districts, or just grant funding. That's just all of these problems are expensive and we need to find money somewhere, and kind of highlighting on the legal side that new development cannot legally be held responsible for operation and maintenance costs. It is excluded under the statute. So to the extent that we want to deal with existing issues, we're going to need to look at where that funding comes from.
Pardon me? And to the extent that we're dealing with existing issues, what?
We need to look at where that funding is going to come from to pay for that beyond new development. Emergency stormwater easements. Some of our local governments here in Volusia already have this. It's just that for all stormwater infrastructure on new developments, there's an emergency easement in favor of the local government or jurisdiction, so that in an emergency, they are not obligated to, but they have the right to go in and repair a pipe or something that's broken. Transfer of development rights is something that was brought up and drafted years and years ago, I think, in the Map A and Map B lists of the county, about preserving environmentally sensitive areas, water recharge areas, and putting density in the municipalities. For wetland mitigation.
That's what the FLU used to look like.
Yes, I'd say the A and Bs, yeah. It never got moved forward, yeah, from the master planning side of things. I do it, yeah. I'd say that's the tip of the iceberg conversation, yeah. The next one, wetland mitigation, is, build on the avoidance and minimization the county has. VCARD suggested a tiered approach where once the county shifts to kind of the UMAM structure, maybe the fee structure increases as well based on the quality scoring of the wetlands to disincentivize impacts to higher quality wetlands. Repetitive loss standards and redevelopment. As we talked about today, the county is going through all of these basin studies. Those will be kind of mitigation plans, like Ben told us, with priorities on how to assist in those areas. As a part of that, VCARD suggests looking at increased either standards or action plans for those redevelopment loss and redevelopment opportunities. Look at buyout approaches, look at design standards, higher design storm strategies there. The next one is adopt the hybrid LID structure, to where there are some required elements and devise the remainder. We've talked about that at length. The next two, the review countywide infrastructure and the regional maintenance program, go together, which is that a few years ago, the county and all of the local governments to the state provided a inventory of their drainage infrastructure. I don't know that all 16 cities participated, or I'll say municipalities. So identifying the gaps in what we know and don't know about that infrastructure, and then building on that to say, okay, we know where your facilities are. How old are they? What materials are they made out of? When do they need to be replaced? What's functioning and what's not? And leading into what of this infrastructure is regional. And water doesn't respect jurisdictional lines, right? That's been talked about a lot. And so what infrastructure needs to be under one jurisdiction? It may not be the county, could be DOT, it could be the state, it could be the county, it could be a local government. But where should we have one targeted jurisdiction that has control of maintenance and kind of the flow of that facility? And then how do we make sure that we're keeping an eye on maintenance for both private and public infrastructure? And then technology innovation, where can we design with the AI assisted pumping systems for ponds before storm events to create additional holding capacity? Where can we build in kind of prep? And that one I think could expand into a million things. So that is a very brief primer on the overall 10 that we put together.
Quick question. I have a thought where this belongs, but I was just wondering, the concept of managed retreat. Did y'all talk about that, or did you see that as going, say your one area? I thought maybe, yeah, that's where I thought it might belong. Did you talk about it, or?
We didn't talk about the phrase. I think that the repetitive loss and redevelopment kind of built in that
Yeah,
structure, as well as some of the, if you were to use the transfer of development rights, those kind of play into where should we be developing, and let's focus on those areas. So
one of the county's priorities that is to streamline the process for getting grants to buy out repetitive loss structures. So, which caught my eye, at least Audubon supported that. So we have, and Clay's mentioned it here several times, and I think Tad as well, that we have bought up some of those properties, but I don't know if we're really taking a good look now at the patterns of flooding and where we're putting good money after bad. This is wonderful because it brings together a number of problems and some sets of solutions as an infographic. And it's more holistic, again, going back to the frustrations that we have when we deal with ordinances. And I almost wish that we were starting over like we started today and said, let's talk about water. Let's talk about too much of it. Let's talk about too little of it, and then break that out. But that's not the way it's worked. And I also think Michelle brought up a very valid point that we didn't pick up the ball and run with it. But she said, is there anything that this committee can do ordinance-wise on existing problematic structures, existing flooding? Is there anything we can do? And a certain person I know once mentioned that, yes, we could be recommending retrofitting of swales and curb and gutter. And I think Ms. Gao might have some thoughts on that. I think at a long time ago at a VCARD meeting, you brought some of those things up before we were on this committee together.
did I? I'm just kidding. Well, I mean, I do think that there are methods, especially when you look at tied into redevelopment. We talk about how a lot of our problems are existing, that things that have been grandfathered.
And forgive me, when we did stormwater, we kind of glossed over redevelopment infill kinds of things because it was so little of what was in the county. But as we look at chapter 50, then we're getting into that. Sorry.
No, agreed. Yeah, and so I think that most local governments have built into their, code nonconformities and how we phase those out over time, because it is legal to phase them out over time, depending on when they come in for upgrades over a certain threshold of their value and things like that. We should perhaps look at when that threshold is triggered, what do they need to do in terms of stormwater infrastructure, and improvements there. But again, this is just one group's perspective on trying to get some ideas on the board to talk about.
So what I'm hearing is that we're going to ground ourselves in some additional expertise, and that we may we may broaden our lens as we go through chapter 50 and look also at retrofits.
I don't think
Okay.
anybody can see my hand, so I'm going to say, yes, I support that.
Thank you, Bliss. And I'm glad you're not shy. And forgive me.
Do you see her hand? Yeah.
I do. I see
Yeah.
that little hand now.
No, I'm just kidding. Here's what I know. Because I started saying, something like the TPO, and I was informed that local governments kind of already have this in terms of flooding, but maybe staff can tell us more.
So the local mitigation strategy is a multi-jurisdictional document and committee of all of the jurisdictions in Volusia County that get together, I say at least 4 times a year, if not more, to identify what types of infrastructure they need funding for, and then we rank them on a list. And whenever those funding opportunities come available, then we collaboratively seek that funding for those items on the list.
And through emergency management.
Yeah, emergency
right?
management is the head of it.
And
They had a few flood, because the floodplain management plan is a part of the LMS document as well. So they had a few public meetings over the course of the past, 6 months or so, because they're updating the LMS document right now and the floodplain management plan.
Yes.
Through the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council is the consultant they're using to update that.
And the only tweak I'll say to the VCARD recommendation is that I think they are pretty, right now in their scope of operations, I want to say they're pretty limited to say this is the pool of funding we got from the federal government that we are deciding on. I think the vision here would be utilizing that same structure and members to expand that to use local funding, grant funding, anything else we can pull in. So it might be a little bit of a divide to make sure they're still following federal mandates, but having that same.
Yeah, and at the last LMS meeting, they actually talked about either having a subgroup of the LMS or the LMS as a whole look for that additional resiliency funding for the infrastructure projects. So that did come up.
Kind of. I will say the TPO is also something that's established by state, federal, I don't know, some government. They're mandated federal to be created. So in the detailed breakdown on the stormwater roundtable, we talk about how there are certain benefits of a state saying, hey, you all need to get together. And part of that is who comes to the table. Because I think in terms of the discussion on flooding, we've talked about DOT a lot. We've talked about St. John's, and getting them to the table either through a state mandate or through asking very nicely of our local partners at those agencies, I think is important, and they have different weights. But the TPO is just something that I was more familiar with when I started drafting. It was great to hear that we have kind of that same thing on the emergency management side.
So about the possible retroactive policies. So please don't shoot me. Trees. So somebody said a while back, and I'm not going to point any fingers, that, trees aren't going to be a part of the problem for, a part of the solution for flooding. And I strongly disagree. I disagreed at the moment. I disagree, forever. So when we leave trees in place, they slow down the movement of water horizontally across the landscape. They do facilitate the vertical transfer of water into the ground. And yes, over a longer period of time, they do help with transpiration. They do transpiration. So, we have put trees pretty far down on our work plan for this year. And I didn't object earlier, but it's kind of unfortunate that we have invested several months in reviewing tree ordinances, and yet now we completely disregard them as part of our sense of urgency to develop solutions for flooding, when in fact, they may be a really critical component of that. And even retroactively, like, that's a thing that we could have developments that have been installed within the last 10 years do, is go back and add more trees as where they can. or, add plantings around their stormwater ponds. And I know there's pros and cons to that, but, that's a thing that can help. And so is that an ordinance we maybe want to review again in light of flooding, that we can ask developments to rethink how they do their trees?
In all seriousness, all joking aside, because I made a quip about trees, we did move away because we got direction from the council to look at stormwater. And we're widening our lens now because we realize that these many things are related. And I think I would like it at least that in the open and broad conversations, how do we solve these problems, things like that would crop up. And then we go back to trees or go back to whatever and say, we need to discuss this aspect of it. If I'm making, because when we started trees, that was, we were naive. We weren't getting first a holistic presentation. We changed that methodology where we would have a presentation by staff and then we would discuss. And we also we had less of a 360-degree view of what we're trying to work on at that time. So, Donna, Jack.
Careful. Is it?
She didn't hit you, did she?
No, I just don't want her to freak. Is it fair to suggest that because we're approaching this from a stormwater perspective, bringing trees into the discussion is not about trees? It's about stormwater and the relationship between trees and stormwater. So we're not revisiting trees. I promise we're not. I don't think that it should be excluded. It isn't, in my mind, a major component, but I don't think that it should be eliminated either.
Yeah, I think maybe it's an opportunity, because we pushed it down the line. I was for pushing it up because we had got caught in it and it was early and I was trying to get it done. And so I suggested to Ginger that it be kind of fused into the flooding area because it's such low hanging fruit, if you will. But the fact is, I think we've got we may just put that as a factor in this. And because it is a low priority, okay, then as we go along in these other subjects, I think we'll see trees as a potential option, and maybe it's the impetus to finish off trees and put it away even before we finish all the other flooding elements more directly.
So in our stormwater calcs land cover runoff curve numbers, we showed a chart from TR 55. There is more runoff generated from grassland or pasture than from woods. So I'm going to say I feel very allergic to even moving back into this conversation. Like I feel my tongue swelling up as I'm trying to talk here. I'm so far from, agreement that we should go back to the conversation. But I don't want to dismiss it. It's already something that's accounted for in our stormwater engineering designs. It's something that we do. The ponds are considered grass. They're not considered a wooded thing. So encouraging the planting of trees, it's going to have positive and negative ramifications. And this is my allergy. I'm not going to be opposed to that, but encouraging it as a requirement or as a code or something else, I'm going to have strong opposition and bring a lot of that argument up just because it is already accounted for. And I think we're getting into an area of science that is emotional and not scientific.
Okay, so we have marching orders for our next meeting. Yes. And it seems to me this is a good moment to perhaps adjourn. Any discussion? Bliss, anything to say about adjourning? I see your hand up. Going once, going twice. Bliss. All right. All those in favor of adjourning? Any opposed? Thank you very much. See you in February.